everyone, and good afternoon. Greetings from New York City. I regret that I can't be with all of you in person and meet with you and chat with you. Nonetheless, I'm honored to join this panel discussing how to start a citizen advocacy program. Cooking a recipe only works when we understand the directions and the context of our own kitchens. Let's say you want to make grandma's famous chicken parm in your own kitchen, but you don't have a grill. Could you use the oven? Or let's say you don't have oregano. Would it taste all right without that? Or could you use basil instead? So now let's say that you've decided to build a citizen advocacy program in your own community. But what if you don't have much free time? What if you don't have any funding? What if people in your community have no idea what citizen advocacy even is? This presentation is divided into two basic parts. In the first part, I'm going to briefly outline the 5 phases of our startup program in New York City. And in the second part, I want to offer 5 encouraging thoughts or reflections on my journey to share with you for those of you who are thinking about starting a citizen advocacy program in your neighborhood. Before getting started, one distinction I want to state right up front, and you'll hear this in the presentation, is that we are a faith-based program. So we work primarily with New York City churches, and you'll hear that as I go on. Due to time limit and the purpose of this presentation, I'm focusing primarily on the technical elements of our startup. To learn the more colorful side about our program, please visit our website, doforone.org, and you can find many relationship stories there. It pains me, for the sake of time, to not include many of these relationship stories that we've made possible through our program, but I will share one story. The best way for me to tell you how and why our program got started is by telling you about a man named Tony, who was born with cerebral palsy in the 1950s in Harlem, New York City. And at age 6, he was sent away to Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. At one point, this institution was the world's largest institution. In 2007, I became his support worker. One time, Tony and I spoke at an inclusion conference. It was supposed to be an inspiring kind of talk. After a few folks shared some stories, and claiming that we've made so much progress since the institutional days, it was Tony's turn to speak. His thunderous voice resounded in his broken speech, and referring to his group home, he said to a live audience, "All these people talk about is paperwork, phone calls, complaining. I miss my family. I wish I could go home, but I can't." And I remember silence filled the room. And so I was sent on a quest. The third time I heard the name Dr. Wolfensberger, a name that's hard to forget, I registered for the next workshop that he hosted with Susan Thomas. In February 2010, I went to a half-day workshop in Syracuse called The Dilemma of Doing Human Services for Pay. How fitting. This is when I learned about citizen advocacy, and this is when I decided to set out and start a program in New York City. Part 1. The 5 phases of our citizen advocacy startup. Phase 1, just an idea. With no money, no name, no website, no logo, no mission statement, no board, with just an idea, I invited a group of friends to my living room for brunch. And I shared about the different kinds of issues that people with disabilities face. It was a wounds presentation of sorts. And then we prayed. This group of people consisted of a pastor, an accountant, a fashion designer, a Columbia student, a lawyer, a teacher, a human service worker, and some others. So the people in situations that disabled people were facing, what I was talking about in this audience was brand new for them, and this was intentional. These brunches eventually led to group visits to go and visit my friend Tony and others I knew who were living in group homes and nursing homes. And it was through this group that some initial one-to-one relationships came about from these visits. And so there was excitement. Over 1 to 2 years' time, it became more than just an idea. But there was a lot of skepticism. And this skepticism, hearing people's questions and complaints, helped us to be better prepared to answer these questions in the future. I heard, aren't only paid and highly trained professionals qualified to work with those people? I heard, not in New York City. You can't do that in New York. What about liability issues? How will you measure success? How will you raise financial support? And so we enter phase 2, concept and research, from the years 2012 to 2015. I knew that if we were going to start a citizen advocacy program from the ground up, then we must learn how to thoughtfully address people's concerns and questions. So in addition to learning citizen advocacy with people like Tom Duty and Tom Kohler and others, I took some nonprofit leadership classes in order to learn, common business leadership practices. And this helped me with fundraising and helped me to learn how to build a case for this program that would speak to the different allies that we would need in order to set up the program. We needed structure. And so the founding board, which was just a few people from our prayer brunches, agreed that the best way to gain some legitimacy and to get off the ground is to negotiate a fiscal sponsorship with my former employer. This is where I was a support worker. So the thought was that by associating with a well-respected service agency, that we would gain some legitimacy in the public eye. And also this would relieve me from some of the administrative burdens and would allow our initial donors to give tax-deductible donations. However, as you might guess, there were conflicts of interest with that setup. The expectations for who we would serve and how we would serve them and the compliance required by the state programs always took precedence over freely given relationship building. Now, thankfully, I was aware at this point of the wisdom found in the principle of program independence. And so the plan in this fiscal sponsorship was that we would become an independent nonprofit as soon as we gained enough momentum and raised enough money. That was clarified in the agreement. During this phase, I did fundraising, conceptualized our mission, started making some initial one-to-one relationships, and I traveled to join 2 different CAPE teams, one in Massachusetts and the other in Georgia. In the course of 3 years, we raised $30,000 in seed money between friends and family. And believe it or not, we got one match grant from the New York Stock Exchange, of all places, for $10,000. And we had made 7 matches up to this point. So this was a strange and trying and difficult but necessary stage of laying the groundwork. And so we were finally ready in 2015 for phase 3, implementation. In 2015, with encouragement from friends and our founding board, I left my job, ending the fiscal sponsorship, and began working full-time. We became an independent nonprofit with the name Do for One NYC. My time was freed up to begin making matches and supporting the initial 7 matches that were made in the previous stage. Admittedly, I'd only made 3 new matches in 2015. So I was then supporting 10 matches, raising money, building the infrastructure of the program, things like that. One thing that I did in this stage was I recruited the best talent I could find for photos, copy editing, and videos. We wanted to appeal and speak to churches, human service workers, families, people with disabilities, people from all kinds of races and backgrounds. We didn't assume that people would just, get this, but we knew that we would have to work hard at helping people to get the importance of this work called citizen advocacy. You could say this was one way that we interpreted the principle of positive interpretations of handicapped people, and also my familiarity with SRV concepts. Some significant moments that year was to co-sponsor a workshop on disability in the church and a well-known faith-based organization called Hope for New York, with strong ties to prominent New York City churches, became our biggest financial supporter. So all of these things also legitimized us in some big ways, which helped to get things off the ground. And so we enter phase 4. Phase 4, I call growth in experimentation. This was between the years of 2016 and 2018. So at this phase, you might say that we've developed community roots and some legitimacy through Christian communities in New York City, and also some human service agencies. This helped the advocate recruitment process significantly, as well as fundraising. Of note, Alexa became an advocate to Alvina. This match became one of those stories that we needed, especially at that time, which illustrated well and with clarity what Do for One's mission can make possible. And you can see that video on our website, actually. Do for One's founding board talked a lot about the pressures and challenges of this work and how to grow the program. The question basically was, who's going to give money to an organization that only serves 10 people, right? One strategy was to host events where people with and without disabilities get together to meet more organically, in hopes that one-to-one relationships can be established somewhat more organically. So we tried it, right? This is the growth and experimentation phase. As you can guess, that was messy. Call it a big, wild, messy way of recruiting and building a pool of advocates and proteges. And as you might guess, we learned by trying this that without direct recruitment, relationships don't just happen like we had hoped, with the exception of a few. In 2016, Do for One recruited, matched, and supported 8 new, enduring relationships, which was our best yet in a year. But as we implemented this experiment of community gatherings in 2017, we see evidence that we were in decline. There were 5 new relationships. In 2018, the community events were full force, 3 new relationships. Still, I would argue that it was a boost that we needed at the time and helped us to grow our trusted network. By 2018, we were engaging with over 100 people with and without disabilities, but more in a community context. We established a lot of favor with families and agencies, which helped us with protege recruitment in the long run. And we built good relationships with churches throughout the city. Lastly, this momentum helped us to recruit promising leaders who later would become good board members and good staff. So crucial to the success of a program. You might say we built a small town in the big city through this approach, and we needed it. At this time, I was still the only staff member of the program. We needed more structure, so we created quarterly orientations where people who are interested in becoming advocates can hear a presentation on wounds and one-to-one freely given committed relationships as a response. We started hosting advocate forums where advocates could get together and share experiences, things like that. So we had kind of a yearly calendar where we provided support and had some strategy for recruitment in place. The key lesson during this phase, however, is it did become clear that unless we prioritize direct recruitment between advocates and proteges, we will fall short of the kind of support that proteges need and that our program is positioned to provide. In clear terms and with evidence, we learned through experience that the mission of citizen advocacy is so easy to drift away from. And so the final phase leading to present day is phase 5, is refocus and refine. This is between years 2019 to today. In 2019, we began to recenter our approach to one-to-one relationship building. There were 9 one-to-one relationship matches made in 2019. Another way to capture the emphasis of this phase is you might say, we recognized the importance of and addressed the issue of clarity of staff function. What are we here for? What are we doing to make one-to-one matches? We had to clarify that in this phase. Turns out that this recentered approach on one-to-one recruitment built on citizen advocacy principles came in good timing. As it relates to the pandemic, we gained even clearer insight that one-to-one relationships that we made before and even during the pandemic can endure and even strengthen during and beyond the pandemic. Here are some key highlights between 2020 and 2022, which contributed to this refocus, recenter, improving upon our program. We invited Tom Duty, Joe Massarelli, and Tom Kohler to spend some time with some of our core leaders. We hired Jane Yoon as a coordinator. In 2020, we made 13 new matches. In 2021, we made 16 new matches. Finally, in 2022, we hired a third staff and we made 19 new matches. We started to diversify our protege recruitment as well, implementing the balanced orientation to protege needs, you might say, principle, at least part of that. We implemented that more intentionally, and we saw more of a balance of instrumental roles and expressive roles being played out in these relationships. Fast forward to now, we are a mid-startup organization of 8 years officially up and running. We have 2 full-time staff, 1 part-time staff. We've made 81 matches in the history of the program, and we're now supporting 70 active relationships. We work from home. We don't have an office. Real estate in New York City is astronomical, and at least at this point, it just doesn't make sense for us. Our support comes from churches and family and friends. We're completely independent from government funding. Our annual budget is somewhere around $200,000 a year. And so part 2 of my short presentation assumes that I'm speaking to some of you who are interested in starting a program in a new community and in a new context. And it also assumes that you would come up to me and you would say, hey, what are some of your reflections on what you've learned so far in this process? So let's assume that that's you, or you know someone who's in that place. That's who I want to talk to. 5 encouraging thoughts to those of you who are thinking about starting a citizen advocacy program. Number 1, do the right thing, even if you're bad at it, and keep working on getting better. There will be a lot that is required of you. Learn the program model well and respect those who have gone before you, and learn from the founding principles. In the beginning, I personally faced a lot of self-doubt. I am shy by nature, and I don't love the center of attention. Ultimately, however, I would not have been able to press forward without faith. This deep calling for me became a moral imperative, and I realized that it would be better for me to be bad at doing the right thing than it would be for me to be good at doing all the wrong things. And I reasoned with myself that even if my efforts fail, at least I failed trying to do the right thing. Encouraging thought number 2, work like an ant. There's a proverb that says, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. I broke down the daunting task of building an organization from scratch into very small, doable tasks over a long period of time. Well, even within these 5 phases, there are small goals that I created for myself each year, each month, and every day. When you think small and you go slow and you grow gradually, you have time to learn from your mistakes and improve without getting so off course that you reach the point of no return. So again, consider the ant. Number 3, the right people are your greatest asset. We learn not to grow faster than we have the right staff to support the growth. New staff bring new skills, new perspectives, new momentum to the work, and you should embrace that as guidance for the pace at which you grow as a program. People are your greatest asset. The right people are your greatest asset, not strategy or big plans or even funding, frankly. When introducing the principles of citizen advocacy to new people in a new context, I would recommend changing the emphasis from teaching the principles to people to teaching people the principles. Number 4, don't be perfect, be persistent. Citizen advocacy is such a well-crafted model, in large part because it was conceptualized by one of the greatest minds, Dr. Wolfensberger. So it would then make sense that those of us who would be attracted to citizen advocacy would be perfectionists. So my advice would be to not let that strength become your greatest weakness. Trust me, you will make mistakes, and you can learn from those mistakes. So be persistent. And lastly, foster a moral imagination. And this might apply to all of us at Citizen Advocacy, and I would love to have a conversation with you about this. Wolf's original vision for citizen advocacy was in response to parents' concerns for what happens to their child when they're no longer around to take care of them. And yet the model itself is adaptable to reaching all kinds of devalued groups, such as youth, elderly, prisoners, and so on. So with that in mind, let me share a few other thoughts that might spark our imaginations a bit and perhaps would warrant some further conversation. First thought is that it is possible to do citizen advocacy without any money. Our program made 7 relationships without any money, and it wasn't until we decided to grow that it became necessary. The other thought is that the culture of human services and society at large has shifted since the original vision of citizen advocacy, which means we should pay attention to what opportunities and challenges are unique to us in this work today. And another thought is cities. Being in New York City, I would argue that it's actually a good place to think about starting a citizen advocacy program. And the reason is because what happens in cities tends to influence surrounding suburban and rural areas. And lastly, seek a multitude of counsel. There's this quotation. It's been said that when you listen and read one thinker, you become a clone. 2 thinkers, you get a little confused. 10 thinkers, you'll begin developing your own voice. 200 or 300 thinkers, you become wise. And I think that if we're craving fresh wind and fresh ideas in the conversation about advancing citizen advocacy, one way for us to do that, I think, is to start developing our own voice within this larger citizen advocacy movement. So I'm going to close by sharing a personal story and show you a few images here. Moving to New York City for me was supposed to be an ambitious and exciting pursuit into the world of music. Like many people, I was fascinated by the city's fast-paced environment and cultural aspirations, but in a bit of an ironic twist, a number of detours in my life led me to meeting Tony, who I told you about in the beginning. My relationship with him profoundly changed the way I understand my own world. My relationship with Tony changed also dramatically when I was no longer paid to be with him. In this next picture, you'll see Tony and I celebrating his birthday at Junior's in Times Square. Tony became family to me. And Tony was a bit of a stubborn man, but he eventually considered me family too. And this next picture is Tony at his first and last wedding and the second time ever traveling outside of New York City. And he actually died about a year after this picture at age 56. So in closing, I've met many people who are restless when confronted by our broken world and yet struggle to find a vision for what to do about it. And that was yet another reason why I thought it could be possible to start a program in New York. The invitation that Tony made to me was to move beyond the political and ideological debates and to learn to sit in the presence of a person who has been wounded by our broken world and learn to be friends with them. Tony invited me into an authentic way of living out my deeply held belief that everyone is made in the image of God. And so that is what ultimately called me to invite others into those kinds of relationships. So thank you very much.